Good afternoon, everyone, to all of our parishioners here in Medford and in Jacksonville and the surrounding area. Today is Sunday, August 30th. August is almost a wrap in the books, and we're about to head into the fall season. Hard to believe, but we are continuing to make progress going forward. Just to let folks know, our next step forward in our parish ministry here is to have key volunteers start to return in September in small prayer groups. Hopefully by the end of the month, those groups that are 25 members or less will start to kind of notify people, make sure they're okay with returning. But little by little, we're starting to make progress there. And school is about to start as well. It's going to start with some distance learning, but we are trying to adapt and be flexible like everybody else. I hope that you are spiritually healthy during these trying times. And today I just wanted to leave you with a message for the week on some challenging readings. Maybe they fit us where we are in this year. Anyway, to start with, I wanted to share with you an interesting essay I read a few days ago. And I would put this essay sort of in the category of psychology or emotional venting, maybe. It was written by a theologian, but it wasn't really theological. He was just trying to put words to his frustration, I guess, on how difficult it is to live the Christian life. That maybe comes as a surprise to some, because there are still people out there who claim that religion is just a crutch for weak people. But very much contrary to that opinion, this writer was sharing an internal temptation that he said he sometimes has to fight with, wanting to edit the Bible to remove difficult sayings. I think you know what I'm talking about. The living Word of God, the sacred Scripture, has the ability to, as they say, comfort the afflicted and afflict the comfortable. And if you're living a comfortable life, surely there are certain passages that will afflict you and make you struggle and suffer within yourself from time to time. By that he meant that, for instance, everybody is comforted by the story of the prodigal son and the prodigal father, because it's a message of love and mercy. We all like to hear those passages about God's burden being light and easy, but sometimes you come across a passage that really convicts you in the heart, and you want to discard it, but you just simply can't. I know that that's a very universal human condition for us to battle with that temptation, but I shared with our congregation today that there are actually some people in history who put those temptations into action. If you know early church history, for instance, there was a fellow named Marcion, and he lived in a time before we had the canon of Scripture that we have today, that we call the Bible. Many people aren't fully aware that that actually took probably at least 4 centuries to put together the Bible as we know it today. There was a lot of discernment by the church and prayer and discussion about what books would make the cut in that collection of works. They considered such things as apostolic history. They wanted the works to be written before the death of the last apostle. They looked at how well they reflected the truth as they understood it. And they also looked at universal popularity, universal acceptance, that a work not be just popular in some city, but that it would have some kind of global appeal. And collectively, with these criteria, they went through and discerned and selected. But before that process had been finalized, a fellow named Marcion came on the scene. And he wanted to propose a different approach. And to summarize his approach, it really had to do with eliminating anything that afflicted him, that made him feel uncomfortable, or that he thought was difficult or inappropriate. So he started right out of the gate swinging for the fences by saying, I want to delete the entire Old Testament. The way he put it, he said, the God of the Old Testament doesn't seem like God as we know him. It must be a false God, because the Old Testament God often sounds grumpy, like God got out of the wrong side of the bed, and that he's always taking vengeance on people and crushing them and defeating them and killing enemies. He said that is so very different from the God we know of the New Testament, who's forgiving and merciful. And so he proposed to eliminate the Old Testament. That's 3/4 of the Bible gone right there from the get-go. Then from the New Testament as we know it today, he continued to say any work from the New Testament that you propose that quotes too much from the Old Testament, I need that to go away too. So for instance, he proposed getting rid of the Gospel of Matthew entirely because it quoted too much from the Old Testament. He said we need to get rid of books like the letter of James and the letters of Peter for the same reason. Then he was also made uncomfortable by any reference to the end of the world, the end of time, and particularly apocalyptic literature, because he said it was weird and it was filled with weird, disturbing, frightening creatures. So the book of Revelation and other apocalyptic references are gone, and on he went until I think he was left with something like 2 letters from St. Paul and majority of the Gospel of Luke after some edits. He essentially was left with a comic book. That could have been the Bible today if it was left to Marcion and his sense of comfortability. Thankfully, he didn't win that debate, but it reveals a temptation that we sometimes have, each one of us, I think, if we're honest with ourselves. And I start by mentioning that because today and this weekend we have 3 readings that would be great candidates for afflicting the comfortable and difficult teachings that are probably somewhat less than attractive, I think, for most people in our humanity. To look at them in reverse order, I'll start with the gospel, which came from Matthew, I believe, chapter 16, in which Jesus very frankly described non-negotiable requirements for discipleship. There were 3 in all. He started with this, that if you want to be his disciple, you must deny yourself. Okay, already I don't like it. Deny yourself means you're asking me to do things I don't want to do. Obviously, that goes against our nature. It reminds me of a definition I read this week about what work is. Work is getting paid to do those things you don't want to do. If they're things you want to do, then they're your hobby or your passion or your love for life. But we all have to do things in life that we don't want to do. That's work. So essentially he's saying Christianity's work. It's not play. It's hard. And you're going to have to go against your own inclinations, your own desires, if you want to be my disciple. Secondly, to maybe put a finer point on it, he said you must take up your cross daily. Well, that is even worse. That implies torture. That implies suffering and ultimately even death. The pathway of love is putting other people ahead of yourself, suffering for the sake of others, and ultimately giving of yourself to the point of giving your life. That is a requirement as well. And the third, although perhaps not unattractive to all people, certainly it's unattractive to some, you must follow him. Not lead, not, hey Jesus, come over here and fix this thing that I don't like. Hey Jesus, come over here and give me this thing that I need. No, if you want to be his disciple, you have to learn to follow. You have to learn to submit, surrender your plan. That's the picture. Those are difficult sayings. That's not a crutch for the weak. That's very hard to do. And to make the point even more clear, he says, essentially the way I summarized it, that you can only have one North Star in your life. You can only have one center of the universe, and that has to be God. That has to be non-negotiable. He said that unless you are willing to die, to give your life for that North Star, which is God, you'll lose your life. Those who try and save their life will lose it. Those who lose their life will save it. You have to be all in to the extreme. You have to radically give everything over to this cause of denying yourself, taking up your cross, and following him. And he further goes on to say, if you make anything other than God your North Star, you pursue the material things of this world which are passing away, you could gain the whole world and lose your soul in the process. It's a dead end. Ultimately, it will not fulfill, it will leave you sad and empty. That is a difficult saying. If you're not afflicted and made uncomfortable by that, then maybe you're a living saint. I don't know. For me, that makes me uncomfortable. That is essentially what St. Paul is talking about in the second reading as well. When he writes to the Romans, he says that Christian followers that he's preaching to, they need to be willing to make of their body a living sacrifice. Again, not attractive. Sacrifice yourself. There are only a rare few people who are willing to jump on a hand grenade to save other people's lives. It's why we call them heroes. They're extraordinary and unique. For most of us, when it comes to that decision point, we take a step backward, not a step forward. But he's saying that's it at the heart. You have to make a sacrifice of your life for others, for the cause, for God. And that's what we see in Jeremiah as well. Jeremiah clearly is one of these chosen sacrifices, but he's fighting it at this point. The passage that we see this weekend is the most disturbing one, in my opinion, in his entire book. Because if you didn't know he was talking to God, a prophet talking to his God, you would say this is an emotionally abusive relationship that we're seeing here. Because Jeremiah is saying in that passage, listen, God, I did everything you asked me to do. I said everything you gave me to say. And what do I get out of it? Do I get a thank you? No. Do I get any kind of warm fuzzies, fervorinos? No. He said, all I've gotten out of this is lost friendships and persecution and shame and attacks and rejection. I have met only with failure and rejection and negativity. And I'm sick of it. I cannot do it anymore. So he says at the end of the passage, I vow to myself, I'll never speak of you again. I'll never bring your name up again. But then when I try, my heart is on fire, I realize. And my bones can't even contain what it is inside me that needs to come out. And I find myself speaking about you again. He's bringing up a great tension that's hard to describe to anybody who's never tried it. But I would say, just to give the example of evangelization, it's a good example. If you've ever honestly tried to evangelize, then you've probably met with more failure than success. You know, you try to give testimony about how God's changed your life. People call you a fake or a Bible thumper, or they want to characterize you in some negative way. Their heart is closed. They don't receive your message. They don't thank you. They may even insult you. It may even end in a loss of friendship a lot of times. You get kicked and beat up and find yourself on the ground a lot of times if you've really honestly tried to evangelize. It's a rough road. And sometimes you might want to say, I'm through with this. This is no fun. This is too hard. But if you're truly fallen in love with God, you find that you can't give up. You just can't do it. I know this is the truth of my vocational story. You know, when God originally, I felt him pursuing me in my heart. I was fighting it all the way. I was avoiding it. I didn't feel like that calling would bring me fulfillment or satisfaction or joy, and so I fought it for over a decade. Now I can say in hindsight I was an idiot. I didn't understand what would bring me happiness and fulfillment and peace. Now I do, but I have found happiness and peace through a very challenging and difficult road filled with tests. Both are true. It's a trial, it is a cross, but it's also the one way to fulfillment. It's a great paradox. Anyway, that is the theme that runs through the readings this week, to really challenge yourself with these difficult sayings that afflict us and try to ask ourselves, is God really my North Star, or have I let something else take that role? I guess in conclusion, I wanted to share a story contrary to that, what it looks like when you choose something other than God to try and fulfill God's rightful place, and how frustrating an end that brings. Um, for those who don't know me well, I'm a very eclectic reader. I read a lot. I especially love history. And this past week, I uh, have been reading about a very fascinating era in human history from the mid 1800s, an era known as the Bone Wars. It comes from the field of paleontology, the science of studying dinosaur fossils. And it's a new field of science from the 1800s. I think they first started, for the most part, finding old human remains, prehistoric human remains like Cro-Magnon man, Neanderthal man, in the early 1800s, and most people didn't know what sense to make of that. People questioned whether evolution was a real thing or not. Especially religious people thought that's an affront to God. God would not let things evolve. He would make them perfectly from the start. And when the question further was raised about extinct species, some people took that as a direct insult against God, saying that would mean God is less than perfect or weak, that he would make creatures that would fail somehow and would die out. So it was a battle really on many levels, spiritually and psychologically, uh, within humanity, but ultimately hard science won out. And shortly thereafter, in the 1850s and 60s and 70s, they started to uncover for the first time dinosaur remains. Some people thought these were demons or remains of dragons, or all kind of things, or that they were just fraudulent, made up stuff. But eventually, paleontology grew to receive wide acceptance in the scientific world. And early on, there were two great pioneers in paleontology, two fellows who couldn't be probably more opposite. One of them was named Othniel Marsh. He was a Yale professor, and he absolutely was fixated on the field of paleontology. Um, but as he pursued his goal, I guess two things are most noteworthy about him. He himself was not a man of material means, but he was extremely effective in fundraising, and he was quite a superficial fellow, apparently. He only would surround himself by rich people because they funded his work, and so you had to be connected. He knew the genealogies of all the important families on the eastern seaboard and tried to get some of their children to be involved in his work so that he could get funding. The other thing about him that people write about is that he was extremely paranoid in his work. But he's one of the two figures in the Bone Wars. The other one was a man named Edward Cope, who was a Quaker from Philadelphia. Unlike Marsh, he came from an extremely wealthy, I think, shipping family. So he had basically unlimited supply of funds. And unlike Marsh, he also didn't have a lot of formal education, but he was a genius. To be sure, he was kind of self-taught in the fields of biology and botany and all of these other areas. And these two rose up as the two greatest figures of early paleontology. Um, you may know, if you know anything about paleontology, still today, the bulk of uh, fossil finds in terms of dinosaurs are taken out of Montana and Wyoming and the Dakotas, in probably an equally sized area north of that in Canada. So that kind of central region of North America. The other main area is central China. This is where the soil and the rock are right for locating these kind of bones. But in the 1860s and 70s, that was also the heartland of the Indian Wars. That was General George Custer's last stand. That was Wild Bill Hickok and Wyatt Earp and Annie Oakley and all these kind of colorful figures. And it was a very dangerous area. There was also a gold rush happening in the midst of these Indian Wars. But that's where their passion, where their work took them. And they were, I mean, this history is so interesting, you can't make it up. But the drama unfolded in the many ways in which they tried to disrupt each other's work. I'm going to guess that it started with the paranoid fellow, Marsh, but they're just endless stories of how they bribed people to steal each other's work. They stole each other's bones. off of shipment trucks. They bribed each other's employees away. They were very involved in counterintelligence, so trying to give false maps out to people to get them lost. On one occasion, one of the guys, actually with a little bit of glue or cement, put together a fake fossil to see if he could convince the other guy to write an article about it and discredit him publicly. They went out of their way to try and name dinosaurs ahead of the other guy, even in cases where they didn't find the bones, so that they could get credit for the find. And they got so consumed in this work that it became like the Hatfields and the McCoys of paleontology. And by the way, with Cope, the one characteristic that people write about him is that he was a hothead who always held a grudge. So once this thing got started, it was never ending. They even went to the extreme of trying to murder each other on occasion. They exchanged fire with each other, shot at each other. There are stories of attempts at poisoning their food. They tried to get local law enforcement to get the other fellow arrested with false reports. They even went to the extent of contacting Indian tribes to try and convince them to make war on their competition, because often they were geographically in the same place, digging and searching for these bones. So extremely colorful, and between the two of them, they were amazingly accomplished. So they cataloged something like somewhere between 8,000 and 10,000 new extinct species of plants and animal. They found nearly 200 new types of dinosaurs between the two of them. Deacon Dennis commented after Mass today, try to imagine a world in which maybe these two guys could have worked together and got along, and perhaps how much more they could have accomplished while they were trying to undo the other's work instead. It's kind of like the real life foreshadowing of so many movies like Indiana Jones, the French guy who always kept trying to steal his finds, or National Treasure. These sort of situations where treasure hunters are pitted against each other. This was the real case of Marsh and Cope. They wanted fame and fortune, they wanted money, they wanted scientific acclaim in the world of academia. That unfortunately was their North Star. And where did it get them in the end? Yes, they did accomplish many things, but we're told that at the end of Marsh's life, he died friendless and alone. He was so paranoid that he drove everyone in his life away. And Cope, this wealthy, younger fellow, he died bankrupt and homeless. It doesn't get us where we need to get. Ultimately, it's a dead end. It cannot fulfill. If we have God and nothing else, we have everything. If we have everything and we don't have God, we have nothing. But if they had God as their center, as their North Star, then these other things would have been frosting on the cake. They would have been nice. They could have been seen as a blessing throughout their journey in this life. Instead, they got it wrong. I leave you that image, the bone war. On the one hand, the bad way to do it, and the way that St. Paul and Jeremiah and Jesus challenge us, a harder way, a much harder way. But paradoxically, the only way to fulfillment and peace and joy. Enjoy the pursuit. Next time someone tells you Christianity's a crutch for the weak, fill their ear with that stuff, and maybe afflict their comfort a little bit. I hope you have a blessed week. Take all this to prayer. We all need to look in the mirror from time to time and question just where God's place is in our pyramid of priorities. He always needs to be at the top. If we let that drift off the mark, things don't go well for us. So let's keep it between the lines. Keep it on track by making sure that God is our priority. God bless you, and have a blessed week. Stay safe. We'll see you next weekend for another spiritual reflection.